Dharmottara's Theory of Concepts, Superimposition and Fiction. Kataoka. I received an email from Atsushi Kanazawa on April 10, 2014, informing me that the 7th issue of the journal would feature a special on the philosophy of language. I had heard talks about this for some time, and felt that it was finally taking off in earnest. The second issue of Indo Gakubukyagako Kenkyū, 2014, 62-2, had just been released at the end of March, featuring Hisatake Ishida's paper on Apoha, titled, A Study of Conceptual Cognition by Dharmottara. I, too, have written several papers on Dharmottara. In this essay, after summarizing my previous understanding of Apoha theory, I intend to directly address the points where I find Ishida's interpretation of Dharmottara questionable. My engagement with Dharmottara dates back to 2008. In December of that year, I published a critical edition of the Apoha chapter from Nyayamanjari in the Memoirs of the Institute of Oriental Culture, 1. In this chapter, Janta introduces Kumarila's critique of Apoha. As is his custom, Janta extracts the core arguments from Kumarila's Slokavartika and explains them clearly in prose. In the subsequent 2009 issue of the Memoirs, I published the continuation of this work, too. There, Janta takes up the counterattack of the Buddhists. That is, the structure adopted is one where Buddhists, whose Apoha theory was criticized by Kumarila, respond to Kumarila's critique. 3. The two Buddhists who appear there, though not explicitly named, are Dharmakirti and Dharmottara. Specifically, the argument unfolds in two stages: first, responding to Kumarila's critique in the style of Dharmakirti, and then, rejecting Dharmakirti's view, responding to Kumarila's critique with Dharmottara's Apoha theory. 4. Thus, according to Janta, the development of Apoha theory proceeds from Dinaga to Dharmakirti to Dharmottara. How should one, as a third party, evaluate this three-stage historical development of Apoha theory as suggested by Janta? Furthermore, how has the history of Apoha theory's development been understood in previous scholarship? Does it align with Janta's perspective, or does it contradict it? These were the initial questions I had. Consequently, in the English preface to the 2009 edition, I provided an overview of this developmental history. 5, and on August 1, 2009, at the 20th West Japan Society for Indian and Buddhist Studies academic conference held at Hiroshima University, I delivered a presentation titled Apoha Theory from Janta's Perspective, summarizing Janta's view. A further developed paper of this presentation is Three Theories of Apoha, The Transition of Models Leading to Dharmottara, published in 2010, 6. Moreover, on December 25, 2010, at the 17th Academic Conference of the Society for the Study of Indian Thought held at Kyoto University, I gave a presentation titled Dharmottara's Theory of Apoha. In this presentation, I substantiated Janta's view with Dharmottara's Apahaprakara and pointed out that Frau Allner's historical placement of Dharmottara was inappropriate. 7. The evolution of Apoha theory. Let me briefly summarize my understanding of the historical development of Apoha theory. 8. The fundamental question in Indian philosophy regarding the meaning of words, sabdartha, is, what is apprehended when one hears the word cow? 9. Dinaga, perhaps drawing on Barthari, considered exclusion, Apoha, to be the function of a word. 10. That is, he believed that the word cow is equivalent to something like cow only, with the addition of eva. 11. Consequently, the function of the word cow lies in the exclusion of non-cows. In other words, cow represents that which is nothing but a cow, signifying what is excluded from other things. In this manner, Dinaga constructed a negative theory of word meaning by establishing commonality through the exclusion of others, without presuming an existent commonality, a universal such as cowness. 12. Dinaga's understanding is that the word cow does not refer to cowness or that which possesses cowness, but rather denotes cow in general by excluding non-cows. 13. To rephrase this using terminology from Indian philosophy, the basis of application, pravdinamita, for the word cow is not cowness, but rather the exclusion of non-cows. 14. As is evident from the structure of the 5th chapter of Brahma-samkhya, Dinaga's primary opponents were those who advocated for universal possessors, Jatamat. 15. Against this, Dinaga put forth the theory of Apoha possessors, Apahavat. That is, he believed that that which is qualified by Apoha constitutes the word's meaning. In the case of cow, this means that which is qualified by the exclusion of non-cows, which is essentially that which is not non-cow. For our ordinary linguistic intuition, Dinaga's semantics appear peculiar, unlike those of Saussure or structuralists who emphasize difference as meaning. While it is clear that cow only implies the exclusion of others, when one simply says cow, negation is not intended, only affirmation is present. However, if we place ourselves in Dinaga's era, the emphasis on negation within the context of semantics was by no means abrupt. In the context of sentence meaning, connection, sasarga, and difference, beta had already been presented as aspects of sentence meaning. 16. Furthermore, as Hideo Ogawa has pointed out, a similar idea of negative word meaning is already discernible in Barthéry. The concept of difference or the exclusion of others as the meaning of words was thus already present. There is no doubt that the background to Dinaga's articulation of a negative theory of word meaning was, as previously noted, primarily the motive of not wishing to admit universals as real existence. 17. Alongside this, what seems to have been important for Dinaga was the problem of apprehending invariable concomitants, the apti. 18. Dinaga himself presents this as one of the grounds for his own theory. 19. Why is the establishment of invariable concomitants relevant to the theory of word meaning? Before delving into this issue, let us first clarify the relationship between words, inference, and conceptual cognition. Inference, anoumana, typically refers to a cognitive process such as inferring fire from smoke. In contrast, in the tradition of debate, there has been an effort to formalize linguistic proofs, syllogisms, as in the example, sound is impermanent, because it is produced. As is well known, Dinaga subordinates the tradition of debate to inference, one of the valid means of knowledge alongside perception. He considered the spontaneous, automatic inferences we make in our minds and the step-by-step, explicit logical proofs as two manifestations of the same inference. 20. He then placed both within the framework of inference, dividing it into two types, inference for oneself, sparthanoumena, and inference for others, pararthanoumena, assigning the former to conventional inference, inference 1, and the latter to proofs in the tradition of debate. 21. Let us refer to this integrated inference as inference 2. Furthermore, Dinaga considered such inference 2 and the cognition of word meaning to be two different manifestations of the same cognitive process. That is, he believed that the cognition of word meaning is also identical to the process of inference and reducible to it. The reason is that words and probands function in the same way. Just as smoke, by excluding non-fire, leads to the cognition of fire in general, so too the word cow, by excluding non-cow, leads to the cognition of cow in general. 22. Let us refer to this further integrated inference as inference 3, 23. Inference 3, which takes commonality as its object, is a type of valid means of knowledge, standing alongside perception, which is defined as devoid of conceptualization, i.e., the connection of names, universals, etc. 24, however, simultaneously, its validity is inferior to that of perception, because it is inherently erroneous in taking non-existent commonality as its object. 25. In other words, inference 3 is a type of conceptual cognition, vikalpa. In that sense, it has the same character as a judgment subsequent to perception, such as the linguistic cognition, this is, a cow. This is what Dharmottara refers to as having the character of determining A to be B, adhyavasaya, and it is something that is examined in detail after Dharmottara. 26. Shoryu Katsura, among others, calls it a perceptual judgment. 27. In Dinaga's system, a concept precisely corresponding to this is not yet fully developed. If we seek a foundational concept, the cognition of conventional existence, saptasajnana, would be it. 28. Dharmottara also expresses this as the conventional cognition, stananam. 29. As seen in the development of the analysis of perceptual judgment after Dharmottara, Dinaga merely suggests the framework for inference 3, which is essentially conceptual cognition. 30. Systematic investigation is entrusted to Dharmottara and Dharmottara. 31. The reason why the theory of word meaning in Buddhism also becomes a theory of concepts is based on the integration described above. From this perspective, it is clear that Dinaga possessed an excellent capacity for generalization. The ideas for individual elements can be traced back to earlier literature. However, the ability to generalize and integrate them, and then to consider each element in parallel, is precisely what makes Dinaga a master. 32. A diagram illustrating the development of inference, including the problems left by Dinaga, especially perceptual judgment, is as follows. 33. Inference 1. Inference 2. Proof inference 3. Word meaning conceptual cognition.
Cognition.
パーセプチュアルジャッジメント。
From the above, it is clear that for Denaga, inference, inference 2, and the cognition of word meaning are parallel phenomena. Therefore, the elements necessary for inference also apply to the cognition of word meaning. One such element is the apprehension of invariable concomitants, the aptigraha. To perform an inference, one must know that smoke is invariably concomitant with fire, that smoke exists only where fire exists. Similarly, to cognize meaning from a word, one must know that the word cow is invariably concomitant with cow. This is the apprehension of the word-meaning relationship. The word cow is applied only to cows. There are two methods for determining invariable concomitants, positive concomitants, and via, and negative concomitants, Vayatarika, 34. Positive concomitants means that where there is smoke, there is fire. Negative concomitants means that smoke does not exist where fire does not exist, 35. Denaga points out that no matter how many co-occurrences of fire and smoke are observed, it is impossible to determine the relationship for all instances of fire and smoke, because fire and smoke are countless. Therefore, positive concomitance is not adopted for the determination of invariable concomitants, 37. What about the remaining negative concomitants? It is empirically true that if there is no fire, there is no smoke. This is because no counterexamples or deviations, where smoke exists without fire, have ever been observed. Denaga believed that invariable concomitants can be determined through non-observation, Adarsana, 38. This idea would later be criticized by Tarmakiri, 39, thus, invariable concomitance is determined solely through negative concomitants, 40. Where there is no fire, there is never smoke, or in other words, smoke exists only where fire exists, 41. Let us consider this in the context of word meaning acquisition, 42. The method for determining word meaning through negative concomitants is as follows. If there were no cows, the word cow would never have been applied, and no deviant instances, e.g., calling a horse a cow, where cow is applied in the absence of a cow have ever been observed. The word cow is always applied only to cows, it has never been applied to anything other than a cow. As indicated by only, here cow leads to the understanding of cow through the exclusion of non-cows. Behind this lies negative concomitants, the fact that the word cow has never been applied to anything other than a cow, based on the non-observation of counterexamples. This is why a negative semantics, rather than an affirmative semantics, is supported when considering the determination of word meaning, 43. Conversely, for Komarila, who recognizes existent universals, there is no difficulty in determining word meaning relations. The relationship between the universal fireness and smokeness applies to all particular instances. That is, through the observation of many instances of the coexistence of fire and smoke, it is possible to determine the universal relationship between these two generals, fireness and smokeness, 44. And once the relationship between universals is determined, there is no need to worry about deviations in any given case. Komarila's critique and the Buddhist response. I will not delve into the details of Komarila's criticism of Denaga here. For the specific content, please refer to Janta's elaboration as introduced by me, 45. A major point is that the ontological status of Denaga's apoa is non-existence, abhava, 46. This is what Komarila attacks. According to Komarila's ontology, non-existence cannot exist independently. For example, the non-existence of yogurt, more precisely, prior non-existence, pragabhava, requires a substrate like milk. The prior non-existence of yogurt is on the substrate of milk. So, what is the substrate for the non-existence that is the exclusion of non-cow? This is the question Komarila poses at the beginning of his critique. Ultimately, Komarila's answer is, isn't there no positive existent that can serve as a substrate other than cowness? Denaga boldly put forth a negative theory of meaning, asserting that the exclusion of others is the meaning of a word. But, Komarila points out, isn't the positive existent of cowness, a universal, ultimately supporting such a negative commonality in the background? In other words, there is no need to set up such a roundabout notion as the exclusion of non-cows, simply admitting cowness from the outset would suffice. Kumarila's critique, which could be called the ontology of apoha, would crush Dinaga's conception of negative semantics. 47. So, what should the nature of apoha be sought in, if not in non-existence? For Buddhists, it is clear that commonality cannot be sought in the external world, as that would amount to admitting universals or universal possessors. So, perhaps it should be sought not externally, but internally? That is, might the cognitive form, buddhyakara, janakara, that arises in the mind be posited as commonality? This is the approach taken by Dharmottara. He considers the cognitive form to be the direct object of a word. 48. The idea of a cognitive form, buddhyakara, janakara, as word meaning is already found in Bhartari. 49. Interestingly, Kumarila himself, after concluding the initial ontological argument concerning apoha, suggests that a cognitive form, rather than apoha, could serve as the commonality, via apoha 38ab. Kumarila's intention is that this would be perfectly suitable for the Yogacara Buddhists, who posit emptiness, sunyata, where cognition apprehends only a part of itself, lacks an external support, and does not depend on external objects. In other words, Kumarila's intention is that just as in the theory of perception, the cognition of word meaning also apprehends cognition itself and not external objects, so too in the theory of word meaning, Buddhists should consistently advocate for emptiness rather than apoha. 50. Dharmottara, in a sense, adopted Kumarila's suggestion. However, he could not simply agree with the reality part of commonality as reality, snyabhashtarapam and via apoha 38a, because for him, in the ultimate sense, the cognitive form, which is the object of conceptual cognition, is erroneous. In this respect, there is a difference on the Buddhist side compared to Bhartari. This point is later clarified by Kamalasila as a distinction between Bhartari's view and his own. 51. At any rate, in his search for what words are directly connected to, i.e., what word meaning is, Dharmottara arrived at the cognitive form. He effectively replaced the content of word meaning from apoha, non-existence, with the cognitive form. However, he never explicitly stated that apoha itself is the cognitive form. For Dharmottara, apoha remained, like for Dinaga, an act of exclusion. 52. Dharmottara still adheres to Dinaga's view regarding what the term apoha refers to. However, the real nature of his apoha theory had already become different from Dinaga's. This became evident in the etymological interpretation by Sakyabhuti. 53. In presenting his etymological interpretation of apoha, Sakyabhuti indicated that apoha could mean the cognitive form as a means of exclusion. 54. This completed Dharmottara's theory of cognitive forms in both name and substance. 55. Janta's understanding of Dharmottara's cognitive form theory can be considered to align with Sakyabhuti's interpretation of Dharmottara's view. 56. The position that the cognitive form constitutes word meaning is well known in previous scholarship as the view of Tarakita and Kamalasila. That is, it has been classified as the affirmative theory, Vidhivada, within apoha theory. 57. The cognitive form theory that Janta presents following Dinaga's theory follows this trajectory, developed in response to Dharmottara. 58. And as something that confronts this cognitive form theory, Janta introduces Dharmottara's theory of fiction. 59. This is what has been widely known in previous scholarship as Dharmottara's negative theory, pratidhavda. However, the perspective introduced by Janta is not a classification based on affirmation and negation. He adopts a classification method based on external, internal, and neither external nor internal. Timeline of philosophers. Period. Philosopher. 400. Bhartari. 470 to 530. Dinaga. 600 to 650. Kumarila. 600 to 660. Dharmottara. 660 to 720. Sakyabhuti. 725 to 788. Tarakita. 740 to 800. Dharmottara. 740 to 795. Kamalasila. 840 to 900. Janta. Dinaga's apoha, at its core, was considered non-existence, abhava. Kumarila identified it as such, 60, and conceived of it as something external. Following this, Janta also describes Dinaga's apoha as external, 61. In contrast, the cognitive form, buddhyakara, janakara, put forth by Dharmottara and others is internal, being cognition itself. This signifies the establishment of an internal apoha. Diverging from both of these is Dharmottara's apoha, which is neither external nor internal, 62. It is characterized as unreal, nastatva, and fictitious, alika, what Dharmottara himself calls fabricated, arapata, 63. Previous scholarship, notably Frowalner and Akihiko Akamatsu, has interpreted Dharmottara's arapata as superimposed. However, I have argued in several papers that Dharmottara's arapata should be understood not as superimposed, y placed upon x, but as fabricated, something non-existent made up as existent, 64. My key points are as follows. Reinterpreting adhyavasaya and arapata. Firstly, the interpretation of determining A to be B, adhyavasaya, as superimposition is discussed in detail within Dharmottara's Apahapratkara, AP, in the context of what Dharmottara means by adhyavasaya in his Pramavanikaya, Pvin, 65. The relevant statement is, cognition acts by determining to be an external object its own cognitive form, which is not an external object, 66. There are four interpretations of this determination: adhyavasaya 1, apprehending A as B, gra, 2, making A into B, kara, 3, connecting A to B, yojana, and 4, superimposing B onto A, samaropa. Among these four, the last, interpreting adhyavasaya as superimposition, samaropa, emerges as the most prominent view, 67. This interpretation is believed to trace back at least to Sakya Buddhi, 68. Here, superimposition refers to placing, superimposing, externality upon the internal cognitive form, which is not an external object. In this view, the internal cognitive form is below, and externality is above. Thus, the function of conceptual cognition, which superimposes an external object upon a cognitive form that is not truly an external object, can be analyzed as a superimposition of y onto x. Superimposed would then mean externality placed upon a cognitive form. Alternatively, by reversing the order, it could be expressed as a cognitive form placed upon an external object, 69. Indeed, Sakya Buddhi also provides such descriptions. The crucial point is the overlapping of the internal, cognitive form, and the external object, merging them into one, which is central to the theory of superimposition, 70. Dharmottara's theory of fiction, on the other hand, does not presuppose such a superimposed structure of internal and external. First, he denies that the cognitive form is the object of conceptual cognition. In his theory of concepts, no role is assigned to the cognitive form. As confirmed by the opening verses of AP and by Janta's introduction, the object of conceptual cognition for Dharmottara is neither an external object nor cognition itself. Furthermore, within the AP, Dharmottara first criticizes the preceding theory that takes the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition, 71. This can be understood as a critique directed at the cognitive form theory continued by Dharmottara, Sakya Buddhi, and Tarakita. For Dharmottara, neither was externality superimposed upon the cognitive form, nor, conversely, was the cognitive form superimposed upon an external object. In fact, while criticizing the four interpretations, he also criticizes the superimposition theory. Dharmottara's intention is that none of the four interpretations are possible, 72. However, Akihiko Akamatsu interprets Dharmottara as adopting the superimposition theory, specifically, simultaneous superimposition. But this would undermine Dharmottara's intent to criticize the cognitive form theory, because the superimposition theory is held by proponents of the cognitive form theory, represented by Sakya Buddhi, and is based on the acceptance of cognitive forms. It is unthinkable that Dharmottara, who denies cognitive forms, would adopt the superimposition theory. For a detailed analysis of the four interpretations, please refer to Kataoka 2013b. Moreover, my interpretation that Dharmottara rejects all four interpretations is not far-fetched. Sin 2011:189 readily acknowledges this, 73. Dharmottara's fiction versus earlier appearances. Furthermore, Janta contrasts the cognitive form theory as stemming from the appearance of self, Atmakyati, theory, 74, while the theory of fiction is rooted in the appearance of non-existence, Asathyati, theory, 75, using terms from Mana's theory of error, 76. First, appearance of self means the manifestation of cognition itself, Atman. According to the cognitive form theory, what appears in conceptual cognition is the apprehended cognitive form within cognition, so Janta's analysis is apartment. On the other hand, appearance of non-existence means that what is non-existent appears as existent. As already stated, for Dharmottara, the object of conceptual cognition is unreal and fictitious, that is, non-existence appears as if it were existence. In this sense, understanding Dharmottara's theory as the appearance of non-existence is an accurate perspective. Akamatsu describes Dharmottara's Arapada within the superimposition theory as the result of superimposing and apprehending external objective reality as belonging to conceptual representation, Samarapada, Akamatsu 1984:81. He understands Dharmottara's theory through the superimposition theory I explained above. Akamatsu assumes that Dharmottara acknowledges the cognitive form here. However, this makes it impossible to explain the difference between the theories of Sakyabhati and Tarakita and Dharmottara's theory. And this contradicts both the descriptions in AP and Janta's descriptions, because Dharmottara himself explicitly states that the cognitive form is not the object of conceptual cognition, 77. For him, the object of conceptual cognition is non-existent, Avastu Vikalpavaya, JNA with Macron 230.1. Furthermore, if Dharmottara acknowledged the cognitive form, it would be incomprehensible why Janta classifies his apoha theory as stemming from the appearance of non-existence theory, rather than the appearance of self theory. A similar understanding of Dharmottara to Akamatsu's can be traced back to Frowalner, 78. I addressed this in my presentation at Kyoto University at the end of 2010 and compiled an essay, which I submitted to the Journal of Indological Studies, formerly Indian Philosophy and Buddhism, at Kyoto University. Unfortunately, due to publication delays in 2012 and 2013, it has remained unpublished for years. I hope it will be published within 2014. The Evolution of Apoha Theory, a Summary. The above outlines my understanding of the progression of three theories, Dinaga Tarmakirti Dharmottara. Exclusion theory, cow denotes the exclusion of non-cows. Cognitive form theory, cow denotes a cognitive form, internal image. Fiction theory, cow denotes a fictitious entity that is neither external nor internal. However, as confirmed by Janta's description, the cognitive form theory seems to have remained a strong Buddhist doctrine even during Dharmottara's time, 79. That is, the understanding of apoha that continued through Tarmakiri, Sakyabhati, and Tarakita was simultaneously criticized by Dharmottara, and also held by Buddhists during Dharmottara's era, 80. This is naturally expected given that the cognitive form theory would later evolve in different forms to Gnanasrimatra and Ratnakirti. Neither of these philosophers ever denies the cognitive form as Dharmottara does. In that sense, if we use Janta's classification, their theory should be regarded as belonging to the lineage of the cognitive form theory, 81. Here, something becomes clear: is it possible to view the two theories of apoha as parallel to the two theories of cognitive forms, appearance of real forms, Satyakarabhata, and appearance of unreal forms, Alakakarabhata, discussed in Yogacara? 82. On one side, there is the appearance of real forms theory, which acknowledges the reality of forms at the conventional level, while on the other, there is the appearance of unreal forms theory, which denies the reality of forms even at the conventional level. The former admits forms such as blue as paratantra, dependent on others. The latter does not admit forms as paratantra but considers them as parakalpita, imagined, 83. The very distinction between apprehended and apprehending is already erroneous. Therefore, when an object such as blue appears as an object, this form is considered unreal rather than real. There is a parallel between these two views in the theory of forms and the distinction between the two apoha theories discussed above. Just as there is a lineage of appearance of unreal forms theory, Arka Dharmottara Ratnakarasanti, so too can we expect a lineage of the fiction theory for apoha, 84. Why did Dharmottara reject the cognitive form theory in his apoha theory and come to advocate the fiction theory? My assessment is that a larger trend regarding the reality and unreality of forms might have been behind this. This point needs further investigation. Furthermore, regarding the development of the cognitive form theory, a detailed tracing of its progression through Prajnakaragupta and other thinkers to Gnanasrimatra and Ratnakirti will be necessary. When re-examined from this perspective, Ratnakirti's inclusion of apoha not only in apoha theory but also in his theory of forms seems to have surprisingly deep implications. 85. My unique assertions can be summarized as follows. Unlike Dharmakirti and Sakyabhati, who followed Dharmakirti, Dharmottara does not acknowledge any role for cognitive forms in his apoha theory. Frowalner considered Dharmottara's apoha theory to be essentially the same as Dharmakirti's. However, this view explicitly contradicts Janta's view, which sharply distinguishes the two theories based on the theory of error. That is, Janta considers Dharmakirti's theory as the appearance of self, Atmakyati, theory, while Dharmottara's theory is considered the appearance of non-existence, Asatyati, theory. This means there is a difference in whether the object of conceptual cognition is a cognitive form or a fictitious form. Frowalner and Akamatsu have interpreted Dharmottara's key concept of arapada, literally that which is raised or placed upon, as superimposed, a cognitive form superimposed on an external object, or externality superimposed on a cognitive form. However, it should be interpreted as fabricated. This interpretation aligns with Dharmottara's arapada being described as unreal, alika, and devoid of reality, nistatva, by Dharmottara himself and by other thinkers, e.g., Janta and Sukarita. Conversely, interpreting it as superimposed does not fit Dharmottara's system. Dharmottara criticizes and rejects all four interpretations of Dharmakirti's Adhyavasaya, determining a cognitive form to be an external object, graha, apprehending as, kara, making into, yojana, connecting to, and samaropa, placing upon. In particular, he examines the last superimposition theory, dividing it into a sequential superimposition theory and a simultaneous superimposition theory, and rejects both. Akamatsu, however, considers the latter, simultaneous superimposition theory, to be Dharmottara's own view. Akamatsu's historical view, based on Ratnakirti's historical perspective on apoha, cannot explain the views of Janta and Sukarita. That is, when considering apoha theory after Dharmottara, it is necessary to consider the broad framework of the opposition between the cognitive form theory and the fictitious form theory. Behind this axis of opposition lies, in fact, the conflict between two opposing ideas within Yogacara, the appearance of real forms theory, that forms really exist, and the appearance of unreal forms theory. The close relationship between the theory of forms and apoha theory can also be confirmed by Ratnakirti's reference to apoha theory within his discussion of the theory of forms. My current research focuses on examining the Buddhist apoha theory from an external perspective. I believe I've provided sufficient supporting material through my critical editions of Janta's 4 texts, 86, and corresponding Japanese translations, 3 of which are already published, 87. The next step is to confirm whether Janta's perspective was shared by contemporary thinkers. To this end, I investigated the works of Sukarita and Vaikaspatimāsra. In Sukarita's case, the relevant section on apoha theory in his Kasika remains unpublished. Therefore, I collated 4 manuscripts and published a critical edition of the section, which could be called an Introduction to Apoha Theory, where Sukarita presents his unique views, Kataoka 2014, 88. This is Sukarita's commentary on the first verse of the Slokavartika's Apoha chapter. In this section, he introduces and critiques the latest apoha theories. Fortunately, Sukarita's fundamental view is similar to Janta's, 89. He introduces Dharmottara's fiction theory as opposed to the cognitive form theory. Sukarita also refers to the proponents of the cognitive form theory who oppose Dharmottara's view as Jnanakaravadan, 90. A similar view can be found in Vaikaspatimāsra. He refers to one group as Jnanakaravadan, cognitive form theorists, or Sakaravadan, proponent of the view of form-bearing cognition, and the other as Nirakaravadan, proponent of the view of formless cognition. It is clear from Vaikaspatimāsra's terminology that Dharmottara did not accept cognitive forms, 91. Thus, Janta's perspective was not unique to him alone but was likely widely shared among thinkers of the 9th and 10th centuries CE. Examining Ishida's interpretation of Dharmottara's theory of concepts. The following section will examine Hisataka Ishida's interpretation of Dharmottara's theory of concepts. Ishida presented discussion of the Bhavashraya material for the study of the apoha theory at IABS in Atlanta on June 27, 2008. Subsequently, likely building upon this presentation and incorporating my series of papers, he gave a revised presentation titled as Cognitive Image: The Meaning of a Word? An examination based on Dharmottara's considerations at the 20th Conference of the Japanese Association for Indian and Buddhist Studies at the University of Tokyo on December 21, 2013. Since both presentation manuscripts are unpublished, I will refrain from mentioning them in this paper. Here, I will only consider Ishida's understanding of Dharmottara as presented in his published Journal of Indian and Buddhist Studies paper. At the beginning of his paper, Ishida provides a Japanese translation of the AP homage verse and explains, this verse clearly states that what is depicted by conceptual cognition is neither cognition nor an external object, and it is described as an unreal fabricated entity, Ishida 2014a 988. This point aligns with my view. Ishida continues, stating, although this point has been repeatedly mentioned in previous research, thereby confirming that Dharmottara's basic understanding has been repeatedly mentioned in prior scholarship. This is certainly true for the first part, neither cognition nor an external object, 92. However, what about the latter part, fabricated entity? The understanding of Arapada as a fabricated entity is not found prior to my work. Leading Dharmottara scholars before me, such as Frohlner and Akamatsu, understood it as superimposed. Therefore, the understanding of unreal fabricated entity was by no means repeatedly mentioned in previous research but was instead a point I brought forth. I have prepared a separate English manuscript that discusses in detail the point that Dharmottara's Arapada is fabricated, not superimposed, and sent it to Patrick McAllister of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. The paper is titled Dharmottara's Notion of Arapada, Superimposed or Fabricated? Let me briefly explain the background of this situation. From April 16 to 20, 2012, an Apollo workshop was held at IKGA of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. It was organized and hosted by Helmut Krasser, 93, Patrick McAllister, and Parimal Patil. Patil was unable to attend due to his duties at Harvard University. We were concerned about who would chair the meeting, but the workshop proceeded smoothly under the chairmanship of Birgit Kellner and the fluent explanations of Lawrence McRae. We collectively read my critical editions of the Nyayamanjari Apoha chapter from 2008 and 2009. I attended the workshop having prepared a provisional English translation in collaboration with Alex Watson. At the same time, I made corrections to the already published critical editions, Kataoka 2008, 2009, including points I noticed. The English translation was completed through our collaborative work, both before and after the meeting, 94. In a discussion before the end of the workshop, it was decided that a collection of papers on Apoha theory would be published, soliciting contributions from participants as the outcome of the workshop. The initial deadline was the end of 2012. From Japan, in addition to Ishida, Hideo Ogawa and Kensho Okada contributed papers. I contributed 3 papers, a revised critical edition, a co-translation with Watson, and the aforementioned essay, 95. Ultimately, the final deadline was extended to July, and a mutual circulation of draft PDFs among authors took place on August 7, 2013. Therefore, Ishida should have been aware of my manuscript by the time of his presentation at the Japanese Association of Indian and Buddhist Studies in Shermaine, August 31, 2013. I also touched on this point in Japanese. It was in my paper What is Apoha, contributed to Journal of Indian Logic No. 5. This issue No. 5 is listed as published in November 2012, but it was actually published in April 2013. In it, I cautioned, here, it should be noted that for Dharmottara himself, Arapada means fabricated, not superimposed, Kataoka 2012 D 123. Furthermore, I addressed Akamatsu's superimposition interpretation in What Did Dharmottara Deny in Apoha Theory, published in South Asian Classical Studies in July 2013, clarifying the difference in our interpretations. This paper is also cited in Ishida's paper. Although I have explained the circumstances at length, my point is this: the interpretation of Dharmottara's Arapada as fabricated is by no means, as Ishida states, something that has been repeatedly mentioned in previous research, but is instead something I have recently put forth. In the English preface of Kataoka 2009:486-13, the distinction was not yet clear. When Janta explains Dharmottara's theory, I translated Arapada as superimposed and explained it as a certain form that is superimposed, Rapada Kinside Karamatram, on an entity. On the other hand, in Kataoka 2010:270-271, I use translations consistent with my current understanding, such as it is a fictitious entity, arapata, and the fabricated entity that is the object of conceptual cognition. At any rate, it has been confirmed that Ishida, like myself, understands Dharmottara's arapata as fabricated. This then becomes the object of conceptual cognition. Ishida explains, conceptual cognition ascertains the object connected with a word, and when it arises by ascertaining such a fabricated entity, and here, what is referred to as the object connected with a word is none other than the fabricated entity, Ishida 2014a 987. Up to this point, there is no disagreement with my understanding. Dharmottara considers a fabricated entity to be the object of conceptual cognition, and therefore the object of conceptual cognition is considered to be unreal, being neither cognition nor an external object. The problem lies in Ishida's subsequent explanation.
石田 2014A、987、ダルモッタラが概念値に、ところどりの継承と、虚構されたもの、という二つの要素を認めていることは本項ではっきりと指摘しておきたい。
In this paper, I would like to clearly point out that Dharmottara acknowledges two elements in conceptual cognition, the apprehended form and the fabricated entity. Let me explain Ishida's intention. Here, Ishida posits two elements. One is the fabricated entity, arapata. As we have already seen, Ishida also acknowledges that Dharmottara considered this to be the object of conceptual cognition. On the other hand, Ishida asserts the apprehended form, grahyakara, as another element of conceptual cognition, distinct from the fabricated entity. He emphasizes, I would like to clearly point out in this paper that Dharmottara acknowledges two elements. Here, what Ishida refers to as the apprehended form, grahyakara, as he himself explains, is interchangeable with appearance, pratibhasa, and reflection, pratibimba. Ishida thus proposes two elements as components of conceptual cognition in Dharmottara. Ishida's view of two elements of conceptual cognition in Dharmottara. Fabricated entity, arapita. Apprehended form, grahyakara, equals appearance, pratibhasa, equals reflection, pratibimba. It goes without saying that the apprehended form here is the same as the cognitive form, buddhyakara, janakara. However, recall, did not Dharmottara deny the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition? My first point of disagreement with Ishida lies here. Dharmottara does not admit the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition. Dharmottara rejected the preceding theory that takes the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition and instead posited the fabricated entity. This was my understanding of Dharmottara. However, Ishida offers a different interpretation. As seen above, Ishida acknowledges that Dharmottara posits a fabricated entity as the object of conceptual cognition. However, Ishida simultaneously claims that Dharmottara recognizes the cognitive form in conceptual cognition. What does this mean? Kataoka, Dharmottara denied the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition and acknowledged the fabricated entity. Ishida, Dharmottara acknowledged the fabricated entity as the object of conceptual cognition. At the same time, he recognized two different elements in conceptual cognition, the fabricated entity and that apprehended form. Ishida translates the homage verse of AP at the beginning of his paper. To confirm what Dharmottara said, I will quote directly from Ishida's translation.
石田 2014A、988、概念値により、他の諸々のものとは区別されたもの、パとして描き出されるもの、それは、知でもなく、外界、対象でもない。まさにそれは、非真実の虚構されたものに他ならない。
What is depicted by conceptual cognition is something distinguished from all other things, rupa, that is, neither cognition nor an external object. It is precisely an unreal fabricated entity. Here, Dharmottara clearly states that the object of conceptual cognition is a fabricated entity, not cognition, i.e., the cognitive form. Despite this, Ishida asserts that Dharmottara acknowledges an apprehended form as an element of conceptual cognition, separate from the fabricated entity. How can such a contradiction be allowed? First, let us try to understand Ishida's intention. As I confirmed while summarizing my views, Dharmottara criticizes the preceding cognitive form theory and instead posits a fabricated entity as the object of conceptual cognition. Why, then, should the cognitive form not be the object of conceptual cognition? This is because the cognitive form is not the object of conceptual cognition but rather the object of perception, which is self-awareness. Sukarita explains this point, building upon Dharmottara's ideas. Before consulting the Tibetan translation of Dharmottara's AP, let's grasp the basic framework of the critique of the cognitive form theory based on Sanskrit sources. First, the cognitive form, janakara, that is taken as the object of conceptual cognition, vikalpajnana, is non-different, ananya, from conceptual cognition. Therefore, the cognitive form, just like conceptual cognition itself, is momentary, kaika, and unique, astra. This means it cannot serve as a commonality for the object of conceptual cognition. Just as pleasure, etc., sakkati, that are self-awareness, spasivity, cannot be the meaning of words, so too the cognitive form cannot be the meaning of words. This is because it is merely the object of perception, which is self-awareness, and thus a unique particular. 96. Furthermore, even conceptual cognition, kalpana, when it perceives itself, in spasavadao, functions as perception, pratyaka, not as conceptual cognition. Dinaga also acknowledges this. That is, conceptual cognition functions as non-conceptual, avikalpika, with respect to itself. Therefore, it cannot function as conceptual, vikalpabhati, with respect to its own form, spakare, which is non-different from itself, spadobin. 97. Sukarita's criticisms directed at the cognitive form theory should be clear. In essence, he argues that since the cognitive form is cognition itself, it is the object of perception, which is self-awareness, and cannot be the object of conceptual cognition. To be more precise, the cognitive form is not the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition, but rather the object of perception when conceptual cognition perceives itself through self-awareness. The form of a cow that appears in our minds, like the conceptual cognition at that moment, is momentary and unique to that particular instance. It does not meet the qualifications to be a commonality that serves as the object of conceptual cognition. Even if a cognitive form exists, it is merely the object of self-awareness. Therefore, positing the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition is theoretically impossible. This summarizes the main points of the critique directed at the cognitive form theory. This critique by Sukarita is based on Dharmottara's critique of the cognitive form theory. I have pointed out the description in Dharmottara's AP in Kataoka 2010 and explained its purport. 98. Furthermore, in Kataoka 2013 B. 61 FF, I translated the AP and examined its content. The purport is similar to Sukarita's critique above. Ishida translates the source AP Tibetan translation as follows.
石田 2014A、987、顔文字、しかめっ面、概念値のところ取りの継承は、自己認識の対象であって、概念値の対象ではない、すなわち、確定されるもの、それが概念値の対象である。序取りの継承は、確定されるものでないならば、それがどうして概念値の対象となろう。したがって、概念値は、語と結びつく対象を確定するけれども、それ自身については、概念化されないものである。
AP 237-28-238 1 That apprehended form, 99, of conceptual cognition, is the object of self-awareness, not the object of conceptual cognition. That is, what is ascertained is the object of conceptual cognition. If the apprehended form is not what is ascertained, how can it be the object of conceptual cognition? Therefore, conceptual cognition ascertains the object connected with a word, but with respect to itself, it is unconceptualized. There is no major problem with this translation itself. The problem lies in the purport of this entire paragraph. Ishida continues his explanation after the Japanese translation.
石田 2014A、987、ダルモッタラによれば、ところ取りの継承は、概念化されるものではなく、直接知覚の一種である自己認識の対象とされるべきものである。ここで、語と結びつく対象と述べられているものは、虚構されたものに他ならない。ダルモッタラが概念値に、初取りの継承と虚構されたものという二つの要素を認めていることを本項ではっきりと指摘しておきたい。
According to Dharmottara, that apprehended form is not something that is conceptualized but should be the object of self-awareness, which is a kind of direct perception. Here, what is referred to as the object connected with a word is none other than the fabricated entity. In this paper, I would like to clearly point out that Dharmottara acknowledges two elements in conceptual cognition, that apprehended form and the fabricated entity. The first sentence of Ishida's explanation is unproblematic. That is correct. The apprehended form, which is a cognitive form, is the object of self-awareness, not conceptual cognition. The second sentence is also unproblematic. The object of conceptual cognition is a fabricated entity and nothing else. The problematic point is the third sentence, which I brought up earlier. Here, Ishida believes that Dharmottara acknowledges the element of apprehended form in conceptual cognition. It is important to note that he uses the subtle expression element here. Why did he use element instead of object? I infer that his intention was probably as follows. The fabricated entity is the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition. The apprehended form, on the other hand, is not the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition but is the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness. Thus, it seems that Ishida deliberately used the term element instead of object to encompass both element 1, meaning the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition, and element 2, meaning the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness. He likely used element as a higher-level concept that includes both objects. If he had simply used object, there would be a risk of misinterpreting it as Dharmottara acknowledges two objects in conceptual cognition, that apprehended form and the fabricated entity, implying that the apprehended form, like the fabricated entity, is an object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition.
Element 1 of conceptual cognition igual a object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition igual a fabricated entity.
Element 2 of conceptual cognition equals object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness equals apprehended form. Ishida repeatedly emphasizes in his paper that Dharmottara acknowledges these two elements in conceptual cognition. In the sentence I would like to confirm here that Dharmottara acknowledges appearance and apprehended form in conceptual cognition, Ishida 2014a and 987, he confirms that apprehended form equals appearance exists separately from the fabricated entity. Also, in the sentence according to Dharmottara's understanding, different elements, namely apprehended form and fabricated entity, can be considered in conceptual cognition, Ishida 2014a 986, he again reconfirms the existence of two elements. However, did Dharmottara truly intend to assert that the apprehended form is an element within conceptual cognition? Sukarita's point is clear. His logic can be summarized as follows. The cognitive form is the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness. Therefore, the cognitive form is not the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition. The main point is in conclusion 2. The same applies to Dharmottara's argumentation. The first sentence of AP expresses this. As Ishida translates, it clearly states that apprehended form is the object of self-awareness, not the object of conceptual cognition. Dharmottara does not wish to emphasize that the cognitive form is an element within conceptual cognition. Rather, he wants to clarify that what is claimed to be a cognitive form cannot be the object of conceptual cognition. As a basis for this argument, he clearly states that the cognitive form is merely the object of self-awareness. Let's organize the logic of AP. The apprehended form is the object of self-awareness and cannot be the object of conceptual cognition. This is because the apprehended form is not an ascertained object equals object of conceptual cognition. Therefore, conceptual cognition ascertains a fabricated entity but does not ascertain a cognitive form. Perception does not have the function of ascertainment, niskaya. Conceptual cognition has the function of ascertainment. The act of ascertainment, this is a cow, and not a non-cow, is the function of conceptual cognition. The object of this conceptual cognition, cow, is the fabricated entity. It is not a cognitive form. This is because a cognitive form, as long as it is the object of self-awareness, is a perceptual object and therefore cannot be the object of conceptual cognition or an ascertained object. Mental image equals object of self-awareness equals non-conceptual cognition's object equals non-ascertained object. Fabricated entity equals object of conceptual cognition equals ascertained object. Like Sukarita, the main thrust of Dharmottara's description is the negation of the cognitive form. He is not actively asserting that the cognitive form exists as an object of self-awareness. It is merely used as a basis for denying that the cognitive form is the object of conceptual cognition. 100. Nevertheless, Ishida places emphasis on this supporting argument and repeatedly states the purport. I would like to confirm here that Dharmottara acknowledges appearance and apprehended form in conceptual cognition. This deviates from Dharmottara's intention. What Dharmottara wanted to say was that the object of conceptual cognition cannot be a cognitive form but can only be a fabricated entity. And as a basis for that, he pointed out that the cognitive form, i.e., the apprehended form, is the object of self-awareness. Ishida's understanding focuses only on point 1 of the overall purport of the following 1 and 2. The apprehended form is the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness. Ishida's emphasis. Therefore, it is not the object of conceptual cognition. Dharmottara's main point. Taking only the basis of 1, Ishida states, according to Dharmottara's understanding, different elements, namely apprehended form and fabricated entity, can be considered in conceptual cognition. However, Dharmottara's main point is different. He did not intend to say that two elements exist side by side in conceptual cognition. The fact is the opposite. He wanted to say that the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition can only be a fabricated entity, not a cognitive form. I believe it has been confirmed how far Ishida's view deviates from Dharmottara's purport. What Dharmottara is concerned with in his theory of concepts is the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition, i.e., the ascertained object, not the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness. This is clear from the outset. What is at issue in the theory of concepts is the object of conceptual cognition. Nevertheless, Ishida acknowledges two elements in conceptual cognition. When one hears the word cow or immediately after perceiving a cow, he claims that on one side there is an apprehended form as the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness, and on the other side, there is a fabricated entity as the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition. However, this would mean that two things, in Ishida's words, elements, are floating within conceptual cognition. One is a vividly perceived form, apprehended form, that is non-conceptual, and the other is a vaguely imagined, unreal fabricated entity that is conceptual. How then does Ishida explain this problem? To address this, Ishida arrives at an acrobatic solution. He puts forth the interpretation that the fabricated entity is superimposed upon the apprehended form as Dharmottara's own view. This resolves the inconsistency of two elements floating in cognition. Despite the two elements actually floating, they are seen as superimposed and appearing as one. From my perspective, Ishida's understanding is nothing more than a misunderstanding built upon a misunderstanding. However, let's first try to understand Ishida's argument step by step, unraveling it as we go.
石田 2014A 986-985直接経験された継承が付託される、重ね合わせられるのは、権限ないし、助手の継承と同時にあるもの、すなわち、それ自体は非存在である、虚構されたものというのが、ダルモッタラ独自の見解である。
Dharmottara's unique view is that the directly experienced form is superimposed, i.e., overlapped, onto something that exists simultaneously with the appearance or apprehended form, namely, the fabricated entity, which is itself non-existent. Here, Ishida has in mind Dharmottara's interpretation of Tarmakirti's Adhyavasaya in Pvin. Ishida translates Pvin, Svapratabase Nartharthathayavasayana Pravartanat, as follows, Ishida 2014a and 986.
石田 2014A 986顔文字、しかめっ面、推理値、概念値は、自らの権限、プラティブサである対象でないもの、アナーシャを対象、アーシャと思い込んで、アダヤージエナ生じるから。
Pvin 246-7 Inferential cognition equals conceptual cognition arises by determining, adhyavasayana, to be an object, artha, what is not an object, anartha, which is its own appearance, pratibhasa, but. Here, Tarmakirti, from the standpoint of the cognitive form theory, explains that the cognitive form is identified with an external object. This provides an explanation for the cognizer's action towards the external object. 101. Immediately after perceiving a cow, a person judges, that is a cow. At this time, they are actually only seeing an image in their head. Nevertheless, they mistake it for the external object itself. In this way, people take action towards external objects. If they were aware that the cognitive form was just an image in their head, they would not take action towards anything external. This description of P-Vin by Dharmottara clearly adheres to the cognitive form theory, which is inconvenient for Dharmottara. Therefore, Dharmottara, in his AP, attempts to reconcile it with his own theory of fiction. In conclusion, Dharmottara understands the appearance, pratibhasa, here as being replaced by his own term, fabricated entity, arapada, 102. According to Dharmottara, the purport of P-Vin is to determine a fabricated entity to be an external object. However, Ishida's interpretation differs from mine. First, Ishida, like Akamatsu, understands that Dharmottara adopts the superimposition theory. That is, among the four interpretations of adhyavasaya in P-Vin enumerated in AP, he recognizes the fourth interpretation, superimposition, samaropa, as Dharmottara's own theory. How inappropriate this is has been dealt with in my critique of Akamatsu's view, Kataoka 2013b. I will not repeat it at length here. I have also explained it above. Let me reiterate the key points. For Dharmottara, determination, adhyavasaya, is none of the four: 1. Apprehending A as B, gra, 2. Making A into B, kara, 3. Connecting A to B, yojana, and 4. Superimposing B onto A, samaropa, 103, 104. This is my interpretation. On the other hand, Akamatsu interprets Dharmottara as adopting the fourth superimposition theory, interpreting Dharmottara's arapada as the result of superimposing and apprehending external objective reality as belonging to conceptual representation, samarapada, Akamatsu 1984:81. In that case, the question arises as to what Dharmottara intended to deny from the preceding theories, and what the difference is from the cognitive form theory. Furthermore, Akamatsu's theory cannot explain why Dharmottara is called a formless theorist, Nirakaravadan, or why his doctrine is said to stem from the appearance of non-existence, Asathyati, theory. Dharmottara's theory, as he himself explicitly states, does not acknowledge the cognitive form as the object of conceptual cognition. Akamatsu misunderstands Dharmottara's intention to criticize the cognitive form theory. He mistakes the opponent's theory for Dharmottara's own, 105. However, Akamatsu's understanding is still somewhat comprehensible to me. Like Frauwallner's understanding, it has theoretical consistency. That is, both Frauwallner and Akamatsu consistently understand Dharmottara's arapada as superimposed, meaning that externality is placed upon a cognitive form. This is the cognitive form theory itself, and there is no theoretical contradiction there. But what about Ishida's understanding? As we have seen, Ishida, like myself, or, to be precise, following me, understands Dharmottara's arapada as fabricated. He acknowledges my interpretation that the meaning of Dharmottara's arapada is fabricated or made up. My intention in translating it this way was to reject the two-tiered hierarchical structure seen in superimposition. Fabrication, on the other hand, is to make non-existence appear as existence. My intention is that the structure of placing A on B is not present in Dharmottara's arapada. This is the intent of my assertion that Dharmottara's arapada is fabricated and not superimposed. However, Ishida acknowledges Dharmottara's arapada as fabricated while simultaneously acknowledging that Dharmottara adopts the superimposition theory. This means Ishida also understands Dharmottara's arapada as superimposed. Akamatsu, samarapada equals superimposed. Kataoka, arapada equals fabricated is not equal to superimposed. Ishida, arapada equals fabricated equals superimposed. It is clear that Ishida's theoretical interpretation is inconsistent. Does he interpret arapada as fabricated or as superimposed? Or does he consider the two to be the same? If so, Ishida's fabricated entity would actually be different from what I consider to be a fabricated entity. In that case, Ishida's fabricated entity would ultimately be forced to mean the same as Akamatsu's superimposed. Akamatsu/Ishida, Sam, arapada equals superimposed. Kataoka, arapada equals fabricated is not equal to superimposed. Or perhaps Ishida believes the following: arapada means fabricated, but samarapada means superimposed, and these two are not contradictory. The fabricated entity is superimposed onto the cognitive form. Indeed, his explanation seems to presuppose such an understanding. Let's revisit his explanation once more.
石田 2014A 986-985、ダルモッタラもまた思い込みを不託と解釈する立場を否定していない。しかしながら、直接経験された継承が不託される、重ね合わせられるのは、権限ないし、助手の継承と同時にあるもの、すなわち、それ自体は非存在である、虚構されたものというのが、ダルモッタラ独自の見解である。
Dharmottara also does not deny the position that interprets determination as superimposition. However, Dharmottara's unique view is that the directly experienced form is superimposed, i.e., overlapped, onto something that exists simultaneously with appearance or apprehended form, namely, a fabricated entity that is itself non-existent. Here, Ishida presents a highly unique interpretation that the fabricated entity is superimposed onto the apprehended form, i.e., appearance equals reflection equals cognitive form. In other words, according to Ishida's understanding, the fabricated entity, arapata, which is the object of conceptual cognition qua conceptual cognition, is superimposed onto the apprehended form, which is the object of conceptual cognition self-awareness. In this sense, the fabricated entity also becomes a superimposed entity, samarapata. Fabricated entity equals superimposed entity. Apprehended form equals object of self-awareness. But wait a minute. Wasn't determination, adhyavasaya, originally a conceptual device to explain how human action is directed toward external objects, 106? That is why, in both the superimposition theory and the fiction theory, the explanation mistaking a non-object for an external object, anartharthathyavasayina, is given. And the question is what this non-object, anartha, is. The cognitive form theory takes Dharmakirti's expression svapratibhasa literally and answers that it is the cognitive form equals apprehended form equals appearance equals reflection. Dharmottara, on the other hand, in his fiction theory, answers that it is not a cognitive form but a fabricated entity, neither external nor internal. Despite this, Ishida ignores the overall purport and adopts the interpretation mistaking the apprehended form for a fabricated entity. Where has the external object in Dharmakirti's Pvin gone? If the element of mistaking for an external object is missing, won't the original significance of introducing the conceptual device of determination be lost? However, in Ishida's understanding of Dharmottara's theory, an external object does not appear in determination. According to him, determination in Dharmottara is the superimposition of a fabricated entity onto an apprehended form. And by understanding Ishida's theory this deeply, we come to know the hidden meaning of why Ishida translated artha in Pvin as object instead of external object. Let's reconfirm Ishida's translation of Pvin once more.
石田 2014A 986顔文字しかめっ面推理値概念値は自らの権限プラティブサである対象でないものアナーシャを対象アーシャと思い込んでアダヤージエな生じるから。
Pvin 246-7 Inferential cognition equals conceptual cognition arises by determining, adhyavasayana, to be an object, artha, what is not an object, anartha, which is its own appearance, pratibhasa, but. In Pvin, artha, it goes without saying, should originally be interpreted as an external object, by artha, for both Dharmakirti and Dharmottara, 107. This is because action, pravti/pravartana, is at issue, 108. However, for Ishida, artha here had to be arapata, fabricated entity, and not an external object. This is because, in Ishida's Dharmottara theory, a fabricated entity is superimposed onto an apprehended form, meaning that the apprehended form is mistaken for a fabricated entity. Therefore, artha in Pvin must refer to a fabricated object, not an external object. In other words, the meaning of Pvin as understood by Ishida's Dharmottara would be mistaking the apprehended form equals non-fabricated object for a fabricated object. It is inferred that Ishida translated artha as object instead of external object because he needed to understand artha here as a fabricated object, not an external one. Ishida's system of Dharmottara's theory begins to show cracks here. First, it cannot explain the initiation of action towards external objects. This is because, according to Ishida's Dharmottara theory, a person mistakes a cognitive form for a fabricated entity. However, merely mistaking a cognitive form for a fabricated entity does not explain why a person takes action towards an external object. Furthermore, Ishida's interpretation contradicts the following sentence from NB 109. NB ad 1.12, 72.1-2 sa punar arapito tho gyamas valakad venvasi yadas tatas valakam adhyavasita pravtavayo numanasia, and arthas tu graya. And that fabricated object, which is, directly, apprehended, by inference, is determined to be a unique particular. Therefore, in inference, the determined unique particular becomes the object of a person's action, while the non-object is the, direct, apprehended object. Here, Dharmottara clearly indicates what Dharmakirti means by non-object, anartha, and what the external object, artha, that is the object of determination, adhyavasaya, is. The non-object is a fabricated object, arapata, while the external object that is determined is a unique particular, svalaka. The fabricated object is the directly apprehended object, gyama, graya, in inference. On the other hand, the unique particular, which is the object of action, pravtavaya, is, in the case of inference, a determined object, adhyavasita, and an indirect object. Non-object equals fabricated object equals object of inference's apprehension, direct object. External object equals unique particular, object of action, equals object of determination, indirect object. Here, Dharmottara clearly shows the understanding, mistaking a fabricated entity for an external object, unique particular. This is clearly contradictory to Ishida's mistaking an apprehended form for a fabricated entity, 110. Why was Ishida led to such a unique understanding of the doctrine? In other words, what led him to the interpretation of mistaking the apprehended form for the fabricated entity? I infer that the impetus lies in the following original AP text cited by Ishida. First, let's look at Ishida's Japanese translation of the original AP text.
石田 2014A、986、顔文字、しかめっ面、思い込みとは、そのような、虚構されたものと、序取りの継承を区別して理解しないという、このような意味である。
AP 238, 23-25 determination means, this sense of not understanding by distinguishing such a fabricated entity from an apprehended form. Ishida must have thought there was clear textual evidence here. Here, Dharmottara states that the fabricated entity and that apprehended form are not understood as distinct. It is thought that Ishida, following this description by Dharmottara, arrived at the interpretation of determination equals not understanding by distinguishing equals mistaking the apprehended form for the fabricated entity / not understanding by distinguishing. However, did Dharmottara really interpret determination in P-Vin as not understanding by distinguishing the apprehended form from the fabricated entity? First, it should be noted that Ishida adds the subject, determination means, here. In my opinion, this addition is incorrect. This is because what Dharmottara wanted to say in this AP is that Svapratibhasa in P-Vin should be understood by replacing it with Arapada. As a reason for this, Dharmottara states that Svapratibhasa equals Grahyakara, and Arapada are not understood as distinct. The point Dharmottara intends to make is that since the apprehended form is not understood as distinct from the fabricated entity, Dharmakirti used the expression Svapratibhasa metaphorically to mean Arapada. The issue is the two possible interpretations of Svapratibhasa, apprehended form and fabricated entity, in the underlined part 1 below, not the relationship between 1 and 2, 111. P-Vin 2, 46.7, 1 Svapratibhase, approximately equal to or the image of Arapite, Narth 2 Rthathayavasayana Pravartanat. The same applies to reflection, pratibimba, which appears when Dharmottara reconciles a similar statement by Dharmakirti. As Ishida quotes, Dharmottara also states there that pratibimba and arapada are not determined as different. Let's look at Ishida's translation.
石田 2014A、985、云々と説かれたすべてのことは、知の継承と虚構されたものを異なったものとして決定することがないために一つであるという言語表現を許容して説かれたものとみられる。あるいはむしろ、そのような立場においては、虚構されたものに対して、映像と言われたのであって、諸種の継承に対して、映像と言われたではない。
AP 239, 7011 Ishida 2014A and 985, all that has been taught is seen as taught while allowing for the verbal expression that it is one, because one does not determine the form of cognition and the fabricated entity as different. Or rather, in such a position, reflection is used for the fabricated entity, and not for the apprehended form. AP 239, 7-11. As is clear from the last sentence, reflection is used for the fabricated entity, Dharmottara's intention is that what Dharmakirti expressed as pratibimba in PV 3.164 up 165 is Arapada and not Grahyakara. The reason given for this is that they are not determined as different. In other words, there is no problem with Dharmakirti metaphorically using the expression pratibimba, which should primarily mean Grahyakara, for Arapada. The original PV text, supplemented with Dharmottara's interpretation, is as follows: 112. PV 3.164 ab, Vikalpa pratibimbiyu, approximately equal to or the image of Rapita, Tanahu nibadhyate / PV 3.165, Vyatarakiva yajjnain bhattayartha pratibimbakam, approximately equal to or the image of Arapatam, / Sabdat tad api narthatma brindisavasanod baba // Regarding the purport of AP translated by Ishida, although ambiguity remains in the Tibetan translation, there is no room for misunderstanding the last sentence. Reflection is used for the fabricated entity. Ishida himself explains as follows.
石田 2014A 985ここでは、ダルマキールティは知の継承と虚構されたものを区別せずに論じているとされる。しかし、あくまでもダルマキールティは虚構されたものに対して映像という語を用いていると説明される。
Here, Dharmakirti is said to be discussing the form and fabricated entity without distinguishing them. However, it is explained that Dharmakirti ultimately uses the term reflection for the fabricated entity. As Ishida himself explains, the form and fabricated entity that are said to be discussed without distinguishing here are the two possible candidates for the non-object, pratibimba. They are not the non-object and external object that are the objects of determination. The absence of the term adhyavasaya in the PV quotation also indicates that Dharmottara's expression discussing without distinguishing here is unrelated to adhyavasaya, 113. Dharmottara is concerned with pratibimba in PV. Dharmottara's method of reconciliation is consistent for both PVin and PV. When Dharmakirti uses svapratibhasa or pratibimba from the perspective of the cognitive form theory, the fiction theory must understand them by reinterpreting them as Arapada, 114. As a basis for this, the reasons not understanding by distinguishing or not determined as different are brought up. Therefore, this itself is not an explanation of adhyavasaya. Rather, the intention is that since the cognitive form is not determined as distinct from the fabricated entity, there is no problem with Dharmakirti using a metaphorical expression. Let's reconstruct and reconfirm the overall picture of Dharmottara's theory as understood by Ishida. Conceptual cognition has two elements, the apprehended form and the fabricated entity. Of these, the apprehended form is the object of conceptual cognition's self-awareness and the object of non-conceptual perception that does not involve conceptualization. The fabricated entity, on the other hand, is the ascertained object of conceptual cognition. Immediately after perceiving a cow, two elements appear in a person's mind, a non-conceptual appearance prior to verbalization, and a fabricated entity that is a conceptual object after the conceptualization process. However, people do not perceive the two separately. Here, determination comes into play. That is, people mistake the apprehended form for a fabricated entity. Determination here refers to superimposition. That is, it is the superimposition of a fabricated entity onto an apprehended form. Also, this determination equals superimposition is also about not distinguishing. Not distinguishing the apprehended form from the fabricated entity is superimposition, 115. This is the overall picture of Dharmottara's theory as understood by Ishida. What do you think? The shape of Ishida's Dharmottara theory, constructed by piecing together individual elements, is extremely unique. As already pointed out, it has many problems. The biggest problem is the part superimposing, overlapping / not understanding by distinguishing, the fabricated entity onto the apprehended form. In Akamatsu's understanding of Dharmottara's theory, this part would be superimposing and understanding external objective reality to a conceptual representation that is not an external object. In my understanding of Dharmottara's theory, this part would correctly be mistaking a fabricated entity that is not an external object for an external object. Dharmottara appears in three different forms: Akamatsu's Dharmottara, superimposition theory; Kataoka's Dharmottara, fiction theory; and Ishida's Dharmottara, fiction theory plus superimposition theory. What is his real form?